So you're in a meeting. An exec shares a direction that they're clearly excited about. You may have a question, maybe an issue or two, but the first few people who respond seem to be nodding along and the energy in the room seems overall pretty positive. And then the leader asks, any concerns? In a way that kind of feels like they're hoping there aren't any concerns. So you think about it for a second and then you say, I think this could work. And then everybody moves on. Maybe you tell yourself you bring it up offline. Maybe you figure somebody else will say something. Maybe you genuinely convince yourself that it's not that bad of an idea. But here's what actually happened. You knew something was wrong and you didn't say it. Not because you were being dishonest, but because saying it out loud felt risky. And saying nothing out loud felt safe. It's not a personality flaw. Newsflash, it's a bias. It's called the social desirability bias, and it doesn't just affect how users respond in research sessions. It shapes how entire teams communicate, what gets raised in retros, what gets flagged before a launch, and what quietly gets left out of the conversation entirely. And if you've ever walked out of a meeting thinking, God, I should have said something, or worse, watched a project stumble over a problem that everybody saw coming, stick around, because that's exactly what we're getting into today. What's up, UX fam? Welcome to another edition of the Cognition Catalog, where every week or so, we'll dig into a new cognitive bias and explore how that bias can impact how our team works together and what we can do to ensure we don't get caught up in the pitfalls. Because working with people is hard, and the more insights we have into the human condition make it just a little bit easier. To learn more about social desirability, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com and click the little bell down there so you get notified when a new episode drops so you never have to worry about falling for any of these cognitive biases again. And shout out to this week's sponsor, Mobbin. If your team is tired of reinventing the wheel every time a new project kicks off, Mobbin gives you access to over 600,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows, all searchable with AI. It's the kind of tool that makes the whole team faster. So visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and see why design teams are making it a company-wide staple in 2026. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, and Zoe for all their support. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told some friends. So there's a meeting that happens on pretty much every software team without exception. Somebody shares a direction, might be a feature concept, could be a roadmap decision, could be a research readout. The room listens, a few people nod, somebody asks a clarifying question, and then the leader says, any concerns? And then silence. Maybe one person says, I think this could work. Somebody else might add, yeah, I like where this is going. And then the meeting ends, and everybody moves on. In those Slack threads afterwards, or in the hallway conversations, or in one-on-ones a few days later, the real opinions start to come out. The timeline was always unrealistic. The research felt thin. Nobody actually thought that feature solved the right problem. So why didn't anyone say that in the room? Well, it's not that people were being dishonest exactly. It's that the room had a social temperature. The team has social norms. And saying the hard thing out loud felt like it would cost something. It might cost a little bit of credibility, or maybe a little bit of goodwill. Or maybe it was just the discomfort of being the one person who pushed back while everybody else nodded along. And that's social desirability at a team level. It's not just something that happens in user research sessions when a participant doesn't want to hurt the facilitator's feelings. It happens inside the team itself in every meeting where the unspoken norm is to perform agreement rather than surface doubt. Now, the tricky part is that it doesn't feel like a bias when you're inside of it. It feels like you're reading the room. It feels like being a team player, and sometimes it can feel like the professional, mature thing to do. But the cost shows up later. It shows up in those sprints that slip because nobody flagged the dependency, or in that launch that underperforms because the research concerns never made it into the discussion, or in the retros where everybody agrees that things went pretty well when everybody knows that they didn't. And that discrepancy between what people actually think and what people say out loud, it's often thought of as a research problem, but it's most definitely a team health problem too. Most teams deal with it all the time, they just don't have a name for it. So let's fix that today. So what is social desirability? Well, we tend to present the most flattering version of ourselves when we think somebody is watching. We might soften criticism, or we might overstate effort or understate effort, depending on the scenario. We might nod along with the rest of the room, and we do it so instinctively that we often barely even notice it. Now, most of us don't think of ourselves as people who bend the truth or, God forbid, lie, but we do it constantly, just not in ways that feel like lying. We might answer questions strategically or frame our work favorably, depending on who we're talking to. We might stay quiet when speaking up might cost us something. It happens in job interviews, it happens in performance reviews, and it happens in those 30 seconds before we respond to a pointed question in a big meeting. The context might shift, but our instinct usually stays the same. Social desirability bias operates through two distinct mechanisms. The first is what we call impression management, and that's the conscious attempt to present yourself favorably when you know that you're being evaluated. And the second is called self-deceptive enhancement. That's a subtler, largely unconscious tendency to give positively biased responses without even realizing that you're doing it. Now, impression management is something that we actively do. We tend to think about it. Self-deceptive enhancement is something that we experience more in our subconscious. Formal research on social desirability goes back to Alan Edwards in 1957 and Douglas Crown and David Marlowe in 1960. They developed what became the most widely cited measure of social desirability in psychological research. What they found wasn't that people were dishonest, it was that the need for social approval was shaping the responses in ways that people weren't fully aware of. High scores on their scale showed an increased responsiveness to social reinforcement, a preference for low-risk behaviors, and a tendency to actively avoid situations involving potential negative evaluation. So the bias isn't really about what we say, necessarily. It's more about what we're willing to risk. Over time, people can begin to partially believe their own socially desirable narratives. It starts to blur the line between self-presentation and self-deception. So a team member who constantly frames their work as on track may not be managing perceptions. They may have genuinely lost sight of that gap. It's what makes this bias harder to catch than a lot of the other ones we talk about here in the show. It doesn't feel like distortion all the time. It can feel just like how things are. Teams tend to develop unspoken norms around what's acceptable to say out loud. And over time, those norms don't just shape what people say. They can shape what people actually notice, what they tend to report, and eventually what they remember about what happened in the first place. Because remember, memories are not recordings. It can show up in retrospectives where the same shallow friction points surface every single time. Demos always land well regardless of what the metrics show afterwards. And in one-on-ones where direct reports describe progress on things that aren't actually progressing at all. Employees tend to underreport conflicts or ethical concerns to avoid appearing disloyal or difficult because everyone's always concerned about raises and promotions. It's important to note that this pattern doesn't stay confined to user research surveys. It becomes the default register for the entire team. And that bias intensifies around anything that carries social weight. Things like admitting a design direction isn't working, or flagging that the timeline was never realistic to begin with, or saying that the research didn't actually validate the hypothesis. These can feel professionally risky depending on the culture and the leadership team. So people just don't say anything, or they might say it once quietly and just hope everybody forgets about it. In the HiPPO effect, the highest paid person's opinion, it makes it worse. When the most senior person in the room signals a preference, even if it's casually or just offhandedly, everybody else runs their own opinion through that quick internal filter of what that leader thinks before speaking. The result tends to look more like alignment, but it's often just self-censorship. Social desirability tends to manifest most strongly when people feel pressure to report social desirable traits or behaviors, particularly in contexts involving threat or uncertainty. And this happens a lot in toxic work environments. And product teams are rarely short on this type of culture. Shifting priorities, missed deadlines, leadership changes, all of that turns up the pressure to perform competence, even when things are genuinely falling apart behind the scenes. And what makes this bias really hard to interrupt and stop is that self-deception component. A team lead can walk away from a meeting genuinely believing that their team is aligned because everybody in the room said they were, because the feedback they received was distorted. They might process it faithfully, but the conclusion is still wrong. The story that the team tells itself becomes the story that the team believes. It's important to remember that honest cultures aren't built through value statements alone. They're built through consistent evidence that honesty doesn't carry social costs. When people see a colleague raise a hard concern and get thanked for it, rather than get managed around or demoted or reprimanded, the calculus starts to shift. That norm starts to change, and that delta between what people actually believe and what they're willing to say out loud starts to close. So, what do we actually do about it? Well, here are a few places that we can start. First, notice when your team is performing instead of communicating. If you're a leader, pay attention when everybody seems aligned a little bit too easily, especially when everybody in the room is really smart. Genuine consensus usually has some friction. It might be a question or hesitation, but when a room full of people that know what they're doing produces nothing but nods, the chances are good that the idea isn't perfect. It's more likely that the social norms of the team made dissent feel costly. So slow down and create a space for that reaction that didn't make it into the meeting. Next, build structures that reward honesty. If the only mechanism for raising concerns is raising your hand in a room full of colleagues, you'll surface the same comfortable problems over and over again. Instead, design the process so honest feedback is easy to give and anonymous where it matters. When patterns start to emerge from structured input, name them and then follow up, because nothing reinforces the value of honesty faster than watching it actually produce change. Next, notice when you're performing agreement. There's a difference between genuinely being on board and staying quiet because speaking up felt risky. If you've talked yourself out of raising a concern the moment you sense the room's vibe, that's social desirability doing its thing. The tell is usually what comes out afterwards. It's in those Slack threads or in the hallway conversations or in the one-on-ones a few days later. If your honest reaction lives outside of the meeting, it's worth asking why. Next, push past the summary and into the specifics. The trickiest version of this bias to catch is when the story somebody is telling has become fully internalized and they genuinely believe it. Conclusions start to substitute for evidence. Things like mostly on track replaces an actual timeline check. The research confirmed it stands in for what users specifically said. So push for the details underneath the summary, because that's usually where the real picture lies. And then lastly, lower the social cost of being wrong. The best fix here isn't necessarily a whole new process. Instead, it's more of a shift in what gets rewarded. Teams that celebrate catching a bad assumption early or treat a flagged risk as a contribution rather than a threat, and they respond to "I was wrong about this" with curiosity instead of judgment, they get more accurate information. Not because social desirability disappeared, but because honesty stopped feeling dangerous. Remember that most of the time, nobody in the room is lying. Everybody's just doing what the team's social norms reward them for doing. Things like nodding along, framing things favorably, or staying quiet when speaking up felt risky. Now, the good news is that it's not a personality trait, it's a culture problem, and culture is something you can actually change. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for the Cognition Catalog for today. I hope I helped to shed a little bit of light on what social desirability is and how we can avoid some of those pitfalls at work. But I'm curious, have you run into social desirability on your team before? How'd you get through it? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. To learn more about social desirability, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com and click the little bell down there so you get notified when a new episode drops so you never have to worry about falling for any of these cognitive biases again. If you want to pick up some big, beautiful art prints of some select biases, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/shop. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the promo code YouTube to get 10% off your entire order. And if you have a favorite bias that you want to see in print, let me know. I'd be happy to take requests. If your team is tired of reinventing the wheel every time a new project kicks off, Mobbin gives you access to over 600,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows, all searchable with AI. It's the kind of tool that makes the whole team faster. So visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and see why more design teams are making it a company-wide staple in 2026. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Rodney, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, Zoe, and many others, and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to those video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX and design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all.